the 16th of March, 1966. A factory floor in Hamilton, Ontario. A single car rolls off the line, and the workers standing around it don't cheer. They just watch it go. No press conference. No celebration. Just silence, and then the sound of machines being switched off one by one for the last time. That car was a Studebaker, and with it, one of the oldest names in American industry disappeared for good. Here's what makes that ending so strange. This wasn't some fly-by-night operation that flamed out after a few good years. This was a company that had outfitted the Union Army with wagons during the Civil War. A company that helped build the aircraft engines that carried B-17 flying fortresses over Germany. A company whose trucks Soviet soldiers trusted more than their own vehicles on the Eastern Front. This was a company that, by every measure that should have mattered, had already proven it could survive anything history threw at it. So how does a company like that just vanish? Not get bought out, not get folded into a bigger name and quietly disappear that way. Just stop. That's the story we're telling today. Studebaker's story runs longer than almost any other name in American manufacturing, and for most of that history, it was a story of adaptation, wagons to electric cars to gasoline engines. Peacetime manufacturing to full wartime production, almost overnight. Every time the ground shifted under this company, it found a way to shift with it, except once, and that one time was the one that mattered most. To understand how a company that helped win a world war couldn't survive the peace that followed, you have to go back to the beginning, to a wagon shop in Indiana, run by 5 brothers who had no idea what they were building toward. In 1852, 5 brothers named Studebaker opened a blacksmith and wagon-building shop in South Bend, Indiana. It was a modest operation by any measure, but the timing turned out to be extraordinary. Within a decade, the country was at war with itself, and the Union Army needed wagons by the thousands to move soldiers, supplies, and ammunition across a continent. The Studebaker brothers built them. By the time the Civil War ended, the name Studebaker was attached to the equipment that had helped hold the Union's supply lines together. That contract didn't just save the company, it launched it. Over the following decades, Studebaker grew into the largest wagon manufacturer in the world, a title that meant something in an era when nearly everything and everyone moved by horse-drawn transport. It was, by the standards of its century, as dominant in its category as any company in America. Then the automobile showed up, and Studebaker had a decision to make that a lot of wagon builders got wrong. Rather than dismiss the horseless carriage as a passing novelty, Studebaker leaned into it. The company built its first electric vehicle in 1902 and its first gasoline-powered automobile in 1904. It positioned itself deliberately in the middle of the market, a step up from the basic, mass-produced Ford Model T, but more attainable than a Cadillac, reliable, respectable, and solidly American. For the first decades of the 20th century, that positioning worked. Studebaker wasn't the biggest name in the auto industry, but it was a fixture in it, a company people trusted. That trust was about to be tested in a way nobody in South Bend could have predicted. The stock market crash of October 1929 didn't spare anyone in American industry, and Studebaker was no exception. As the Depression deepened, the company's finances deteriorated along with everyone else's. In October of 1932, with the company on the edge of collapse, Studebaker attempted a merger with the White Motor Company, a truck manufacturer, hoping the combination might stabilize both businesses. The merger fell apart. Without that lifeline, the numbers kept getting worse. Studebaker's debts climbed past $5 million. Its cash reserves were nearly gone, and on the 18th of March 1933, the company went into receivership. It wasn't a bankruptcy in the sense of Studebaker disappearing outright, but it was a full admission that the company could no longer manage its own finances without a court-appointed overseer stepping in. The human cost of that collapse was immediate. Albert Erskine, the company's president, was forced out of his role as the receivership took hold. Erskine was already dealing with serious health problems and mounting personal debt, and within months of losing his position, he took his own life. It's a grim detail, but it's a real one, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something about how total this crisis was. This wasn't an abstract balance sheet problem. It broke people. What happened next is the part of the story that usually gets skipped over, but it matters enormously for what comes later. Studebaker's new management moved fast. They dropped the Rockne brand, a lower-priced line the company had launched just a few years earlier. They sold off Pierce Arrow, a luxury nameplate Studebaker had acquired in the 1920s. They stripped the company down to its core business and refused to take on the kind of risk that had nearly killed it. By January of 1935, a reorganized Studebaker Corporation emerged from receivership, leaner and considerably more cautious than the company that had gone in. That caution would define Studebaker's culture for the next 3 decades, and for a while it looked like exactly the right lesson to have learned. Then the world went to war again, and Studebaker was handed the biggest opportunity of its existence. By February of 1942, the Studebaker plant in South Bend, Indiana wasn't building a single civilian car. Every square foot of it belonged to the United States government. The path to that moment started a little earlier. In January of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, Studebaker signed a contract with the Army Air Forces to build aircraft engines. The original plan called for the company to produce the Wright R-2600, an engine used in the North American B-25 Mitchell bomber, and the government financed the construction of new manufacturing facilities in South Bend, with additional plants in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Chicago to make that possible. But before a single R-2600 rolled off Studebaker's lines, the Army Air Forces changed course. They needed something else more urgently. The Wright Cyclone 9, the engine that powered the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Studebaker retooled for the Cyclone 9 instead, and the numbers that followed are staggering. Between 1,942 and 1,945, Studebaker built 63,789 of these 9-cylinder radial engines. At one stretch, between July of 1942 and October of 1943 alone, Studebaker turned out more than 64,000 units of a single Cyclone variant, the R-182097, more than any other manufacturer building that model anywhere. Every one of those engines went into a B-17, and every B-17 carrying a Studebaker-built engine flew missions over occupied Europe, dropping bombs on German industry and military targets while fighting through flak and fighter interception to get home. A car company from Indiana had become one of the most important suppliers to America's strategic bombing campaign. And that wasn't even the biggest thing Studebaker built for the war. The Studebaker US-6 was a 2.5-ton, 6-wheel drive military truck, and it might be the single most underappreciated piece of equipment to come out of American industry during the Second World War. Studebaker manufactured 197,678 of these trucks at its South Bend plant between 1,941 and 1,945, with an additional 22,204 built by REO Motors in Chicago under subcontract, for a combined total approaching 220,000 vehicles. These trucks hauled troops, ammunition, food, and fuel across every terrain the war produced, from the mud of the Eastern Front to the deserts of North Africa. Here's the part of the story that doesn't get told enough. A huge share of those trucks, estimates range from roughly 150,000 to as many as 200,000, depending on the source, went to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program, arriving as early as the autumn of 1941. They crossed into Soviet territory largely through the Persian Corridor, the supply route running up through Iran. And once they arrived, Soviet soldiers didn't just use them, they came to depend on them. The US-6 handled Russian mud and Russian winters better than a lot of the Red Army's own vehicles, and it earned a level of trust from Soviet troops that few pieces of foreign equipment ever received. That trust outlasted the war itself. After 1945, Soviet engineers studied the Studebaker design so closely that their own post-war military trucks, the ZS-151 and later the ZL-157, were direct descendants of it, staying in production into the 1960s. A truck built in Indiana quietly shaped Soviet military transport for a generation. And then there was the Weasel. The M29 Weasel started as a strange, specific idea from a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike, who wanted a lightweight vehicle that could move commando units fast across deep snow as part of a planned raid on German-occupied Norway. Studebaker's engineers in South Bend took on the challenge and built it, a compact tracked vehicle so light it could cross terrain that would swallow a conventional truck whole. The Norway raid it was designed for never happened. The mission was canceled before the Weasel saw combat in the role it was built for, but the vehicle itself was too useful to shelve. Studebaker built 4,476 M29s and another 10,647 of an improved M29C variant between 1,943 and 1,945, and these machines ended up serving in almost every theater of the war. At Normandy, during the Battle of the Bulge, in the Walcheren landings in the Netherlands, and in the brutal island fighting at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. A vehicle designed for a raid that never happened became one of the most versatile pieces of equipment in the entire American arsenal. To meet all of this, Studebaker's workforce nearly doubled, growing to around 20,000 employees, with roughly 9,400 of them working specifically on the aircraft engine program across South Bend and Fort Wayne, and the financial turnaround was just as dramatic. In 1941 alone, as war production ramped up, Studebaker posted net earnings of $2.49 million on sales of $115.7 million. After a decade defined by receivership and caution, Studebaker wasn't just surviving. It was thriving, doing exactly what it had always done best, adapting to whatever the moment demanded, faster and more completely than almost anyone expected. If the story ended there, this would be a very different kind of video, but the piece that followed the war would ask Studebaker to adapt one more time, and this time it wouldn't. When the war ended, and American factories switched back to building cars for civilians instead of trucks and engines for the military, Studebaker rode a genuine wave of post-war success. The company brought in designer Raymond Loewy, whose sleek, forward-looking styling gave Studebaker some of the most distinctive cars on American roads in the late 1940s and early 1950s. For a company that had spent the 1930s clawing its way out of receivership, this was as good as things had ever looked. In 1950, Studebaker posted its best sales year ever, roughly 268,000 vehicles. That's a genuinely impressive number for a company of Studebaker's size. But here's the problem hiding underneath that success, the kind of detail that separates the companies that survive from the ones that don't. Studebaker's cost structure, its factories, its labor agreements, its overhead required selling around 282,000 cars a year just to turn a real profit. Even in the best year the company ever had, it fell short of that number. Studebaker's single greatest sales year in its entire history as an automaker still wasn't enough to cover its own weight. That's not a minor detail. That's the entire second half of this story, hiding in plain sight in 1950. Through the early 1950s, the pressure kept building. Studebaker was carrying labor costs that its smaller production volume couldn't comfortably support, while Ford and General Motors, sitting on enormous scale advantages, launched an aggressive price war that squeezed every independent automaker in the country. Studebaker wasn't alone in feeling this pressure. Across the industry, smaller manufacturers were being pushed toward the same conclusion: combine or die. In 1954, Studebaker merged with the Packard Motor Car Company to form the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of consolidation that might create a stronger competitor to the Big Three. In practice, it combined two companies that were each already struggling, and neither one had the capital or the market position to lift the other up. Packard's once prestigious lineup was reduced to badge-engineered versions of existing Studebaker models, and within just a few years, the Packard name was retired from the automotive market altogether. The merger that was supposed to be a rescue plan for both companies ended up accelerating the decline of one of them completely. Studebaker wasn't finished trying, though. In 1959, the company introduced the Lark, a compact car that ran directly against the grain of Detroit's obsession with bigger, flashier vehicles. It worked, at least for a little while. The Lark gave Studebaker a genuine, if temporary, sales rebound, proving the company could still read the market correctly when it had to. Then, in 1962, Studebaker made its boldest and final swing. New company president Sherwood Egbert championed a radical new sports car called the Avanti, a fiberglass-bodied vehicle unlike anything else in the Studebaker lineup, designed to completely reset the public's perception of the brand. Egbert reportedly hoped to sell as many as 20,000 Avantis in the car's first year. The reality fell far short of that ambition. Production and supplier problems with the fiberglass body meant Studebaker could only build around 1,200 Avantis in that critical first year, nowhere near enough to generate the momentum Egbert needed. Total Avanti production across the car's entire run at Studebaker came to roughly 4,647 units between mid-1962 and the end of 1963. By the time the South Bend plant closed, only about 1,600 Avantis had actually been sold to customers, with another 2,500 or so sitting unsold on dealer lots. The Avanti was, by most accounts, a genuinely bold and interesting car. It just couldn't be built fast enough or sold in large enough numbers to change the arithmetic that had been working against Studebaker since 1950. On the 20th of December 1963, Studebaker closed its South Bend, Indiana plant, the same factory complex where five brothers had built wagons for the Union Army, where engineers had designed a snow vehicle for a commando raid that never happened, and where thousands of workers had built the engines that powered B-17S over Germany. After more than a century in South Bend, the automaking side of Studebaker's operations there simply stopped. Production didn't end completely. Studebaker shifted its remaining automobile manufacturing entirely to a smaller plant in Hamilton, Ontario, hoping the company could remain profitable there on a much smaller scale, producing somewhere around 20,000 cars a year. But even that modest target proved out of reach. In 1966, the Hamilton plant produced only 8,947 cars before the company finally gave up on building automobiles altogether. The last Studebaker rolled off the line on the 16th of March 1966 and left the plant the following day. 114 years after five brothers opened a wagon shop in Indiana, the Studebaker name stopped appearing on new vehicles for good. It's worth sitting with how strange this ending really is, because Studebaker didn't fail the way most companies fail. It wasn't undone by a single bad product, or a single bad decision, or a single external shock it couldn't have seen coming. It survived the Great Depression. It survived the death of its own president in the depths of that crisis. It survived a world war by transforming itself almost overnight into one of the most important suppliers to the American war effort, building the engines that carried flying fortresses into combat. the trucks that Soviet soldiers trusted more than their own equipment, and a snow vehicle built for a raid that never even happened. Time after time, when history demanded that Studebaker change, it changed, and it usually changed faster and more completely than anyone had a right to expect. What finally ended Studebaker wasn't a war or a depression or a single catastrophic mistake. It was a cost structure that never quite matched its production volume, a gap of roughly 14,000 cars a year that the company never closed, not even in its single best year in history. That gap sat quietly underneath every success the company had in the 1950s, and eventually it caught up. The trucks Studebaker built are still part of this story too. The Zs and ZL trucks that Soviet engineers based on the US-6 stayed in production for 2 decades after Studebaker itself stopped building cars, meaning that in a very real sense, Studebaker's wartime engineering outlived the company that created it. The Avanti name also outlived Studebaker, passing through a series of small independent manufacturers who kept building cars under that badge for decades after South Bend went quiet. Somewhere in Indiana, in a Soviet truck depot that no longer exists, and in a handful of fiberglass cars still built decades later by people who refused to let the name die completely, pieces of Studebaker kept moving long after the company itself had stopped. There's a version of this story where the moral is simple. A company that built one of the most important pieces of military hardware in the Second World War couldn't survive 20 more years of peacetime competition. And that's true, as far as it goes. But the deeper lesson is a little more uncomfortable than that. Studebaker didn't fail because it stopped being capable. It failed because being capable was never the same thing as being large enough, and by the time that gap was impossible to ignore, there was no wartime contract left to paper over it. The next time you see an old Studebaker parked at a car show, or a photograph of a Lend-Lease truck rolling through the mud somewhere on the Eastern Front, it's worth remembering that the same factory floor built both of those machines, and that everything that company was capable of still wasn't enough to save it from a set of numbers nobody wanted to look at too closely. If you want to see more stories like this one, about the industrial history behind the machines that actually won the Second World War, subscribe, and let us know in the comments which company's story you want to see told next.